All right.
So good afternoon. My name is Lauren. I am the chair of the ACRL IS Teaching Methods Committee, and this is part 2 of our recent panel, New Framework, New Directions, Teaching Information Literacy in a New Context. We have our third featured teaching librarian panelist with us today, who is going to walk through her presentation that we weren't able to get to during part 1. So to introduce, we have Andrea Baer with us today. She recently joined the University of West Georgia as an instructional services librarian. Formerly, she was the undergraduate education librarian at Indiana University Library. Andrea also teaches professional development courses on information literacy education at Library Juice Academy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea so she can walk through her presentation. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you also for the opportunity to present on this, and my apologies for the technical difficulties I had during the live event. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be able to record it afterwards. So my talk, as you can see, is titled Asking So What in the Information Literacy Classroom, Conceptual Understandings, Teaching for Transfer, and the ACRL Framework. I'm going to start in focusing more on the framework as a conceptual document and some ways that I'm approaching it. And then in the latter part of my presentation, I'm going to discuss some of my experiences in teaching workshops for librarians on the framework and some of the kinds of themes and approaches to the framework that have emerged from some of that work. That work in teaching these workshops with other librarians is really where I've engaged the most deeply with the framework at this point in time, because my library work in the past several years has focused mainly on supporting other librarians in their teaching. Now in my new library position, I'm also looking at applying concepts from the framework to a credit-bearing information literacy course that I'll be teaching in the fall, and also to a first-year writing course that's taught by another instructor. So again, I'm going to start by thinking a little bit conceptually about the framework. As a starting point, I'd like to touch on aspects of the framework that really resonate with me. I'm excited to see how it's prompted many critical and creative conversations about our teaching, and also about our instructional roles on our campuses. While I don't think the framework is a perfect document, it is doing one of what I think are central goals, that is to generate dialogue in our profession about how we approach information literacy as about far more than search mechanics. Qualities of the framework that I find especially powerful are its stress on information practices as rhetorically and socially situated, that is, that they are very context dependent, and also its foregrounding of conceptual understanding. Those 6 frames that comprise the framework are repeatedly referred to as conceptual understandings that are really at the heart of the framework. And as they mentioned in the introduction to the framework, they put this emphasis on conceptual understandings largely because the framework is informed by Wiggins and McTeague's work in backward design, and in particular the ideas that they outline in their book Understanding by Design. So Wiggins and McTeague talk a lot about the kind of bigger picture of learning and why learning really matters for students. And I think that that's a really valuable thing when we're thinking about information literacy instruction, because it's so easy to get lost in kind of the details of click here, or, you know, how do I get this book, that it can be easy to lose sight of, you know, what are the larger reasons why students should care about what they're doing with information and information creation. So again, at the heart of the framework is really these conceptual understandings that are intended as, you know, a kind of interconnected concepts that allow students to have a broader approach to information and information use. But the framework also talks a lot about information being highly contextual and information practices being highly contextual. So often there's kind of a challenge of translation of how do I take these large overarching concepts and apply them in different contexts. And this brings me to this theme of learning transfer, that is being able to apply something you did or learned about in one situation to another situation. And there's been some really interesting research done on learning transfer that I think can really help us to think about the framework and how we want to approach it. And one of the more comprehensive publications on learning transfer comes from How People Learn, which came out first in 1999, and then there was an expanded version in 2000. It's also online as an open access book, so if you want to check it out, it's easy to get to. And they show a lot of implications for learning transfer. They've basically looked at educational research over the decades from across disciplinary areas. And one of the chapters focuses on differences between novices and experts. And the differences they find have a lot of important implications for thinking about how we teach for transfer, so how we teach students to, apply these understandings of information to many different situations. First of all, they talk about how experts notice features and meaningful patterns of information that are not noticed by novices. Secondly, they discuss how experts have a great deal of content knowledge, and that content knowledge is organized in ways that reflect a deep understanding of the subject matter. And then thirdly, this knowledge can't be reduced to a set of isolated facts, right? Because they're rather connected through this kind of larger conceptual framework. And because of this large overarching understanding of that subject area, these experts are allowed to apply their abilities and understandings to many different situations. So they're basically transferring their knowledge from one situation to another. And this is something that's really hard to do if you have not already been immersed in a certain discipline or discourse community. So when we think about teaching about these conceptual understandings, we're really asking students to do a lot of really challenging but important work. And these are things that, of course, do not develop quickly. And so thinking about the long-term nature of developing conceptual understandings and the value of reinforcing ideas again and again is, I think, a really challenging thing for us because most of our instruction still tends to occur in a one-shot session. These findings about learning transfer also show that it's often better to cover less content and to really focus more on, focusing on these concepts, highlighting conceptual understandings, and being willing to let go of a lot of content. So what does it mean for us as instructors then? How do we deal with the reality that library instruction is still occurring primarily in one shot? Well, I'm not going to be able to completely answer that question because I think it's a big one that I think most of us are grappling with quite a bit. But I think one important thing to keep in mind about the framework is that it emphasizes that it should be a flexible document with lots of options for implementation. So it's not intended to be prescriptive, and that means that we're all going to have to develop creative approaches to it, and there may be pieces of it that make sense for us in certain situations and other pieces of it that don't make sense for us in certain situations, and that's fine. I also appreciate that the framework asks us to be sensitive to local context and to think about common goals that we have with other educators. So as we do these things, we can also start to expand our understandings of our roles as educators as taking shapes that we might not even have thought of in the past. So I'd like to kind of shift my focus right now to talking a little bit more about online workshops that I facilitate on teaching with the framework. People have shared their experiences and perspectives on the framework throughout these workshops, and a number of themes frequently emerge from those conversations. Often people articulate assumptions they had about the framework that have contributed to frustration with it, and sometimes with a sense of overwhelm or even paralysis. So I'm going to note a few of those assumptions that people sometimes share having experienced, and the different ways of thinking about the framework that many of these workshop participants have articulated. One is the idea that librarians can or should teach all ideas articulated in the framework. That is a daunting and I think impossible task. Secondly, that the framework necessitates a complete overhaul of an instruction program. Next, that teaching about conceptual understandings is an infringement on faculty's domain. And related to that last point is that if faculty teach information literacy, is there then still space for librarians in the classroom? So this first idea that librarians should teach all ideas articulated in the framework, of course, we know that this is really an impossible task, and I think that's been a lot of the frustration with the framework. Because the standards are written in such a different way, they're really about, the student will do these specific things rather than have these broader conceptual understandings. It can be easy to then start thinking about the framework in kind of that same mindset to feel like you have to cover it all. But we really can't, and that's why it again is this document is pushing us to think about our teaching in other ways. And also thinking about the fact that while we may not be able to engage in entirety with a single conceptual framework in any given session, there is a value in highlighting these concepts and having students engage with them over a period of time. I think the more exposure they get to those things, more opportunities they have to think about them and relate them to their actual experiences with information and information use, that those things will become more meaningful for them. Another assumption is that the framework necessitates a complete overhaul of the instruction program. But the more that people have worked with the framework, I've found that they say, I actually am realizing I've been teaching these things for a long, long time, but maybe just didn't articulate them with this same terminology. So the framework can give us a kind of vocabulary for talking within our profession, with students, and with other educators about how we're approaching information literacy through a kind of more theoretical lens. And I think having that language is really useful for us, but it's also really useful for our students. There's a book called Writing Across Contexts that comes from the field of composition and rhetoric, and they talk about a course where they were teaching for transfer, that is writing for transfer. And that giving students a vocabulary for talking about concepts that were really key to writing was incredibly helpful for the students, and the students being able to apply that writing to different situations, to different disciplines. And these last two assumptions are interconnected again. So the idea that if we teach about these things, we might be infringing on faculty's domain, or that if faculty teach information literacy, it might not leave enough space for us to teach. So I think this is an area where we're really having some really good conversations right now, expanding views of what it means for us to be educators and how we partner with other educators, and often expanding our approaches to how we actually think about instruction. More and more people being involved in things like collaborative assignment design, or even collaborative course design, or teaching credit information literacy courses, or creating online materials that students can access outside of class as well. But again, all of these, our responses to these difficult questions are really dependent highly on context. And so there's no single approach that the framework is suggesting. And again, the framework is opening dialogue across professions, not just within our profession. The framework, is also important to remember, has been conceived of as a set of living documents, so we don't have to think of it as a closed text. And I've got a few references there. There are three more resources that I was going to share with you that I think were actually on a different PowerPoint slide. I think the first PowerPoint that I had sent in maybe got uploaded instead of an updated version. And so I'll just mention those things real quickly. One of them is sorry, I'm just looking through my notes here. One of them is the BEAM model, which is basically a rhetorical vocabulary for source use. And that talks about using sources for different rhetorical purposes. For example, sources that are used for background information or for evidence, for arguments, or for methods or theoretical background. So that's one place where you can talk with students about how they're using sources themselves, but also how they might evaluate the way that other sources use them. And secondly is the graphs model for assignment design, which comes from Wiggins and McTeague and Understanding by Design. They have an acronym, this acronym graphs that they use for creating what they call real-world tasks. That is, tasks that a person might actually do in their own professional or personal life. And this acronym, I won't read all of it, but if you want to look it up, it is basically a way to write an assignment and to identify a specific rhetorical purpose and a specific audience that the student will be doing this task to inform that audience and to have a specific purpose. And then the last resource I was going to mention is RAFT, R-A-F-T, which comes from John Bean. It's a way of designing problem-based writing assignments. He uses the letter R for role or purpose, A for audience, F for format or genre, and T for task. So those can be used for writing just short assignments or long writing assignments. It's a way, again, of emphasizing the context in which students are going to use information and do research. So those are kind of some practical things that might be useful as we think about the framework, thinking on the one hand about these big conceptual understandings, but then also thinking about how do we ground these conceptual understandings in these very specific, highly contextual situations. Yes, so thank you very much for your time, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to answer questions during the actual event, but please feel free to email me if you'd like. The email is in the slides.